Good morning and welcome. It's great to be with you here again. If you'd like to have your Bibles open at Ecclesiastes chapter 7, that would be helpful. Emily will be having it up on the screen as well, so you can follow along there. But if you have it in your Bibles or at home, that'd be really helpful. No one can discover anything about their future. A depressing line, but it was in our passage that we read out today. How do you live in a world where you don't know your future? Many people do it by seeking control. That gives the illusion of safety. I think it's one of the reasons we find the virus so scary. It shows that we don't have control. And religious people are often no different. Whether it was ancient peoples doing rituals to the rain gods to provide rain, or the Israelites following proverbs or following the rituals of the Torah to ensure their salvation. Ecclesiastes pokes holes in this theory. It shows that things don't always work the way they should, and that our attempts at control are often futile. So far in Ecclesiastes, we've heard some strange advice and strange observations from a man called the teacher. We've looked at a variety of observations of the world from the teacher, and then Marty or Tim have explained those observations in the context of today. Although often depressing, the teacher's advice or observation seems to make sense in this broken world that we live in. It's sometimes helpful, oftentimes depressing, and almost always strange in the context of the Bible as a whole. In the first part of today's passage, it is no different, and the teacher seems to take it to a new level. In the very first verse of chapter 7, he says that the day of death is better than the day of birth. In verse 2, that it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. And in verse 3, that frustration is better than laughter because a sad face is good for the heart. Surely now the teacher has gone too far. His great learning has driven him insane. Well, today I'm going to say that not only is that conclusion incorrect, I'm going to say that today's passage is actually a great way of understanding the teacher and even understanding Ecclesiastes as a whole. That the passage today is a key to unlocking the wisdom of this strange book. Today we're going to look at the passage in three broad chunks. Firstly, in verse 1 to 8, under the heading, Death is Better Than Life, How to Be Wise. Then in verse 9 to 19, being wise is good, but it's not everything. And then finally from verse 20 to chapter 8, verse 1, no one is wise, no one is righteous. So the first point, death better than life, how to be wise. One of the things that books like Ecclesiastes do is that they ask life's deep questions. Questions that we often don't feel comfortable asking, either because they're depressing or we don't even want to know the answers. The focus here in the first half of chapter 7 is on death. Looking at verses 1 to 4, the common thread is the idea that death and mourning is better than feasting and pleasure. Now, of course, this is not an absolute rule. As Ecclesiastes itself says in chapter 3, there is a time to weep and a time to rejoice. Like most proverbs, this is not a rule, but wisdom, knowing the right thing to do at the right time in the right way. So what does the teacher mean? He wants us to be aware of our mortality, to learn from life and death, to not seek meaning in laughter or feasting. The teacher's assorted wisdom here tells us to make sure we reflect on death. Going to a funeral is better in this sense. It teaches us to be wise in the way we live and prepare to die. The main reason why the day of death is better than the day of life or birth is because, strangely, death has more to teach us about life. Let me give an example. I find it remarkable how Emily gets to connect and hear about people's lives at the hospital as she works and the opportunities she has. She has found that during people's times of sadness, their times of mourning, when someone's life has fallen apart, that people aren't then thinking about their fun times of life. It instead leads them to a time of reflection of their own lives. They think about how they should live going forward, and they think about what happens when you die. Why is this better than the day of your birth? Because when you are thinking about death, you are focusing on what is eternal and what is important in the life you're going to live. The teacher isn't saying don't rejoice on the day of your birth, or he's not saying that times of death aren't sad. He's saying there is wisdom in reflecting on life and pondering life to come during times of mourning. I think this can actually be quite hard in modern times. Less people die young, and when people do die, they often die removed from us in hospital in a sanitised situation. It is much easier to focus on comfort and relaxation and escapism than it is to reflect on life and death. I think we often get home from a tough day at work or a painful time and seek to shut out the pain of everyday world. We feel better about it all once we have spent time binging our favourite TV show or drinking the evening away. And in times like now, with COVID dominating the news, I think it can be tempting also to retreat and just avoid watching the dire news, to be at home by yourself. And while being at home by yourself, watching TV doesn't exactly fit with the house of pleasure or the house of feasting picture that Ecclesiastes paints, I think it's the same message of ignoring the world and just switching off. We should be engaged with what's happening in the world, looking out for others, and helping with things like the food pantry that we run here is a great way of doing that, of not shutting out the world. But it's not just death that the teacher focuses on in this section. Just like in Proverbs, the teacher offers other tidbits of advice on how to be wise. Verse 5, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Verse 7, extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Verse 9, do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. These are all practical bits of advice that apply just as much today as they did thousands of years ago. Learning from correction from a smart person is, of course, better than mindless singing. We have seen the effects of corruption here in New South Wales with the allegations against MPs and even the Premier. And we know the terrible impact that anger through domestic violence has on families. These are words worth paying attention to. And wisdom is not just about asking questions. Sometimes it can mean not asking the wrong questions. In verse 10, the teacher says, do not say, why are things not like they used to be? Whenever I read that, I gave a little chuckle. It's amazing that something which is still said today was also being said thousands of years ago. And while we do need to learn from the past, getting stuck back there is not good. Blaming the past is often an excuse for inaction, the reason we give for not moving forward. So I think this too is good advice from the teacher. And that brings us to our second point. Being wise is good, but it's not everything. Now you might be thinking, so far this is all well and good, Mark. You've given helpful advice, but at the beginning of this talk, you promised that this chapter would shed some light into how Ecclesiastes works and that it would help explain how the wisdom fits into the Bible as a whole. But so far, like in past weeks, you've just explained how the observations and wisdom of the teacher make sense in today's world. Well, here, as we reach the middle of chapter 7, I think we can get a deeper understanding of how Ecclesiastes works. I think verses 13 to 18 give great insight into the book as a whole. One of the things that I love about Ecclesiastes is that the teacher seems to see both sides of the equation. He doesn't seem to oversimplify as much as, say, Proverbs can seem to. The teacher points out both sides of things. On one hand, he will say, it's good to work hard. On the other, he says, it can be pointless because your stuff goes to people who are undeserving. Or here in this passage, he says, being over wicked can lead to dying before your time. But he also says that the wicked live long in their wickedness. While it can seem frustrating that the teacher does not give a clear, definitive message, I think it's refreshing that he gives something here that's realistic. It shows that just because you do one thing, it's not always going to turn out the same way. And this is why he says you shouldn't be over-wise or over-righteous. The over-pursuit of righteousness and wisdom, just as much as falling into foolishness and wickedness, brings bad consequences. For both are incompatible with the fear of God. Both represent, in their own way, a refusal to accept the limitations that God sets on us humans. Let me give you an example of being over-wise and over-righteous. First, over-wise. There are plenty of examples of wisdom in Proverbs that say if you do certain actions, it's going to lead to wealth. That is wisdom. Overwise, however, is prosperity gospel like in some churches today, that take those passages of wisdom and instead make them absolute promises, something they weren't intended to be. Or over-righteous. Consider the Pharisees of the New Testament. In seeking righteousness, they added a bunch of laws to ensure that they didn't break God's commands, all while ignoring the intent of the law, to love God and to love neighbour. When wisdom and righteousness become idols, they are no better than those who fall into wickedness and foolishness. The key to this passage is found in not seeking wisdom and righteousness for their own sake. It's about understanding why everything is meaningless. Or to say it another way, why we have no definite control over things. We can see this in verse 13 to 14. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. It is here in these two verses that the teacher acknowledges that no matter how wise or righteous we can be, ultimately, we aren't in control, but God is. Times may be good, times may be bad, but our wisdom is not going to help us discover the future. Ultimately, wisdom is about seeing rightly, seeing things what they are, who we are, who God is, where he has placed us, seeing the opportunities he's given us, and what he's called us to do with the gifts that he's given us. And yet we need to realise that wisdom is limited. The wise person, no matter how wise, will not be able to straighten every broken thing. We should look at the day that God has given us, and if it is a good day, enjoy it. This has been made clear multiple times through Ecclesiastes so far. But also, many days will not be good, which is okay too. That reflects sin and the brokenness of the world. But what neither of those things do is negate the belief that God is in control and has power. One way to see the difference between no hope for the future and trusting God is to compare Ecclesiastes 7 verse 13 to what the teacher said back at the beginning of the whole book in chapter 1 verse 15. The wording of the verse is almost identical. What is crooked cannot be made straight. But the first time the teacher says this, he leaves God out of the picture. He's looking at the world without God and saying how meaningless it all is. But here in chapter 7, he brings God back into the picture. He's looking at the world with God in its context. And he says God is putting both the straight things and the crooked things under his own control. That is the gift of Ecclesiastes. To realize that there isn't a formula that we can do to ensure a good life. While there is wisdom, it's not going to guarantee happiness. Instead, true wisdom is about trusting God, not Proverbs. It's about realizing that God is the one who is in control. And that's why the teacher finishes this section by saying that we should fear God. The fear of God is one of the great themes of the second half of this book of Ecclesiastes. As the book moves from focusing on the meaninglessness of life, it now focuses on the fear of God. And when we get to the very end of Ecclesiastes, the teacher concludes of all his writings that we should fear God and keep his commandments. To fear God is to revere God. It's to know that he is God and we are not. It is to hold God in awe for his mighty and awesome power. For having the true and proper fear of God is going to help us not be overwise or over-righteous. And that brings me to my third and final point. No one is wise, no one is righteous. If we are to be truly wise and truly righteous rather than being overwise and over-righteous, how do we do that? When right here in Ecclesiastes 7, the teacher says in verse 20, "Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins." And then in verse 23 he says, "All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I'm determined to be wise, but this was beyond me." Does this leave us where we were back at the beginning of my talk? Unable to know our future, and no different really from someone who doesn't believe in God? No. This assumption that we can't know anything about our future is wrong, because it ignores the fact that the person who does control and does know the future can tell us. Our future is only unclear if it is left in our control. And God has made it very clear what happens with regards to believing or not believing in Jesus. You may recognize verse 20 in Ecclesiastes here from Romans chapter 3. It's where Paul is telling the depressing state of humanity. You can see the verses up on the screen. Like the teacher in Ecclesiastes 7, he's saying that no one is righteous, not even one. And like the teacher in chapter 7, verse 23 and 29, he also says that no one is wise, because there is no one who understands, there is no one who seeks God. But unlike the teacher, Paul doesn't just leave the solution as fearing God. Paul goes on to say more descriptively in a few verses later, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God is made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe." It is here that Jesus provides an answer to the teacher's questions and turns everything on its head. Jesus is truly righteous. This means that we are not in the same boat as someone who doesn't believe in God. As we face the good days and the bad, we can have confidence because we know that God is in control. This doesn't mean that Christians don't struggle with the question of what the future holds or meaninglessness. We do struggle with that. But it means that we do have someone to talk to these doubts about. As Eugene Peterson said, believers argue with God, skeptics argue with each other. We can know our future because we are told by God what that future is. If we follow Jesus, we are told that we will be saved. We will live forever and will go to be with God once we die. This is really where the hope comes through from understanding that it's God who is in control. Ecclesiastes is a great book, as it not only gives wisdom on a good way to live life here and now, but it also acknowledges that while living on this earth, things don't always work the way they should. But it then gives hope, as it points towards God being the one who is in control. And that, combined with our knowledge of Jesus, can give us comfort in this chaotic world. Amen.